come at this through all of this. Boy,
Of
this has been a
course.
lot. And we are up now in, let me come up at 30. In, in 10, 4. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show. Happy New Year. Happy 2026. And we have got things off to a roaring start with bombings in Nigeria and the removal of a president and his wife and his son in Venezuela. The corporate media is calling it a capture. Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia and their son, all of them politically very potent figures. But is it a capture or is it a kidnapping? There is no ICC indictment. There is no arrest warrant. There is no UN Security Council calling for military intervention. There's no congressional declaration of war. What is going on here? Hey, Dave Dowling, how you doing, sweetie? Happy New Year. Everybody like and share, like and share, like and share. Yes, I am back. I am back. I am back. Haven't been under the weather. I am back up above water. And so I said, let me reach out to this man who says that there is world beyond war. Yeah, there is one. If you can imagine, as John Lennon said, we don't just have to imagine it. The Bible tells us to study war no more. And really, you do best what you do the most. Sadly, we do war the most. And it is not doing us any good. We're now broke. And so now we're going after everybody's assets. Do you really think that this is 1823 when the Monroe Doctrine was enacted? They're calling this the Donroe Doctrine. It's 2025, not 1823, not even 1825. It's a different world, David Swanson. So I want to know, with all the work that you do with Roots Action and World Beyond War, what do you think of this? What did you think when you got up yesterday morning and saw that they had taken Nicolas Maduro and his wife and his son out of the country? They had gone and taken them out of bed. And as you look at different press reports, you can see that he was betrayed from within, but that's the way it happens. The press reports tell us that the CIA have been on the ground, at least this is what they tell you, since August, working with someone on the inside to get him out. And President Trump said late last year, look, our companies were making so much money, and we're going to make so much money for the country. That's not who they're going to make the money for. But we are going to be back in the business of making so much money from this oil and from these other precious minerals. And we want our money back. We want our oil back. It's ours. That's what he believes. That's what the oligarchs believe, that it is their oil underneath the feet of the Venezuelan people. Think about that. Do you really believe that no one was killed? Do you really believe that no one was hurt? I saw a young lady, David Swanson, on TikTok, and her brother is in a coma. She said it was so violent because they dropped bombs all over Caracas all night long. Think about that, everybody. Do you really think they went into the presidential palace and they hurt no one? They took the president and the first lady out of their beds, everybody. And there was so much chaos, so much disarray, according to the media reports, that the president and his wife were trying to get to their safe room and they could not do it. They couldn't get there in time. But what does this really mean? Well, I had to go back to something that you wrote in November. That's right. Let me remind you, David Swanson, World Beyond War. You said war on Venezuela is a lie. You saw that we were going down this road then. You wrote in 2010, I wrote a book called War is a Lie, and I wish you all would get it, with an updated edition in 2016. If I'm lucky and find time, you said, and maybe if they ease up on the wars for a little while, I'll get a new version out in 2026. But I can already apply the basic idea of the book to the threatened war on Venezuela. The argument in the book is, of course, not that wars aren't real, but rather that nothing that is commonly said to justify them is true. And so the book begins thus. Quote, not a single thing that we commonly believe about wars that helps keep them around is true. Wars cannot be good or glorious, nor can they be justified as a means of achieving peace or anything else of value. The reasons given for wars before, during, and after them, often three very different sets of reasons for the same war, are all false. It is common to imagine that because we never go to war without a good reason, having gone to war, we simply must have a good reason. This needs to be reversed because there can be no good reason for war. Having gone to war, we are participating in a lie. And as I bring this up to you, I think of my grandfather, Charles Henry Jackson. Bless his heart. The last time I saw him alive, I was 15. And he was talking about his Second World War experiences, David. And he had never in all of my lifetime ever, ever, ever talked about the war. He talked about being sent, the black troops being sent into Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and where they were sent to rescue the Jewish people who had survived the Holocaust. He said, but we were sent there, A, because we were black and we were quite clearly not Nazi. He said, but really the overriding reason, he said, baby, the real reason was because these camps had been laden with bombs and we could have landmines. And many of us were killed trying to get into these buildings. He said, and then I came home and we were greeted with all of this excitement when we got to New York, but I had to get on the train to come to South Carolina. And of course, there were Nazi POWs on the train. But when we got to Washington, they had to trade seats with me. I had to move to the colored car. And then when I came home, I had to work for them. He said, war is never a good thing. He said, and it's not just because of what we saw with racism. No, he said, I lost friends. And I think about them today. And he wasn't much longer for this world. He was gone 6 months later, David Swanson. And when I look at him now, I see pictures of him and he looked like he was an old man, but he was only 59. Wow.
Yeah.
So when we look at what happened with President Maduro and his wife and son, didn't just happen to them, it happened to the Venezuelan people. He had his opposition on the left, to be sure. But we haven't gotten over the Kennedy assassination. I don't care where people were with him politically. Now, the Kennedy assassination, which I missed, is something that hangs over the heads of all Americans. So talk to me about what it is that we saw and that we're seeing and that we're being asked to believe.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. There were actually a lot more Nazi POWs in camps in the United States than there were Jews and other peoples threatened with extermination by the Nazis. There wasn't much interest or much room for them. And that hypocrisy carries over to what happened at the end of that war with trials at Nuremberg, where victor's justice was completely hypocritical, but there was this claim that going forward, the rule of law will apply to all nations equally, including those who are enforcing a hypocritical victor's justice here. And the supreme international crime, as they defined it at Nuremberg, was one country attacking another country. So this is what we have just seen. One country, the United States, attacking another country, Venezuela, the supreme international crime, and justifiable by nothing else. And we have it presented to us as the opposite of a crime, as law enforcement. Marco Rubio says, I was acting on behalf of the Justice Department, not the War Department. This had nothing to do with war at all. This is simply law enforcement. So this is, if France were to go into South Korea and kidnap somebody and take them to France and prosecute them for violating a French law, or vice versa, or this is complete anarchy. This is the notion that governments can go anywhere in the world, kidnap somebody, drag them back to their country, and prosecute them there for their own crimes, that whether or not they were a crime in that person's country, it's lunacy. And here I am in Charlottesville, Virginia, James Monroe's town. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Monroe Doctrine at 200 and what to replace it with. We are beyond that 200-year mark now with the Monroe Doctrine, and it's openly celebrated, and it's presented to us not as an outrage, not as imperialism, but as law enforcement. And it simply doesn't matter what lies you tell about drugs, right? There are ridiculous lies, but were they 100% true, it would do absolutely nothing to justify shooting missiles into Venezuela, or kidnapping people out of Venezuela, or murdering their guards, or killing 100 people on boats near Venezuela. The Venezuelan government, like every government on earth, has horrible shortcomings, not a single one of which justifies going in and overthrowing the government. It simply doesn't. The U.S. government has a lot of shortcomings, and I don't want some other government to come in and overthrow it. The results wouldn't be good, and they're not going to be good in Venezuela. And even the shocking honesty of just coming out and saying we want to steal their oil doesn't justify the crime of war any more than the beautiful pretenses of hypocritical, humanitarian reasons. It just because you're being honest doesn't make the crime any less of a crime. So this is kidnapping, this is bombing, this is murder/war. And the United States Congress has blood on its hands. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee has blood on its hands. The U.S. corporate media has blood on its hands. The New York Times and Washington Post were told before this attack on Venezuela that it was going to happen, and said nothing. And after it happened, ran headlines with, Venezuela claims that such and such just happened, as if they hadn't been pre-informed about it by the U.S. government.
So
And
wait a
the
minute.
Congress.
They knew before Congress knew.
Well, I don't know who in
Yeah.
Congress knew when, but certainly most of Congress didn't know until after it had happened. And the New York, and certainly some people at the New York Times and Washington Post knew before it happened, and considered it their duty not to tell us. This is absolutely outrageous. And then to pretend that they hadn't known, and that they weren't even sure it was true, that it was just an allegation from the Venezuelan government. And so they've got blood on their hands, as always, with every war. Without them, without the New York Times, we couldn't have any of these wars. And the Congress, I mean, they've gone for decades now supporting the overthrow of the Venezuelan government, supporting comical coup attempts, cheering in the United States Congress for would-be leaders of coups like Juan Guaido, supporting murderous sanctions that have, to this point, killed a lot more people in Venezuela than the violence. And failing, there's going to be another vote in the coming days here in the Senate, and everybody should be telling their senators how to vote. But failing twice so far in the Senate and once in the House to pat that, they have this absurd ritual where the supreme international crime is legal except where the U.S. Congress, gets off its knees and declares it redundantly to be illegal in this particular case. And so the House has failed and the Senate has failed twice on votes from using the 1973 War Powers Resolution to stop this particular war. There's going to be a new vote in the Senate in the coming days. But of course, this is beyond the crime of war. I mean, this is absolutely inexcusable behavior for elected officials in the United States of America or anywhere else. The Congresswoman from Illinois, Delia Ramirez, I think her name is talking about impeachment. A handful of them are talking about impeachment, but it's absurd that anyone would be allowed to stay in office doing this sort of thing. I mean, if Congress members had any self-respect, they would be ending the war and hostilities. They would be cutting off the funding. There's a vote coming up in the coming days where they could cut off the funding for any of this activity. They would free Venezuela's kidnapped president. They would bring all the U.S. troops and equipment back to the United States, back here to Virginia. They would cancel the sanctions and the blockade on the no-fly zone. They would renounce overthrowing other governments and the Monroe Doctrine, and they would impeach and convict and remove from office Donald Trump on down. I mean, if this is a recipe for international chaos in an age of unprecedented militarization and nuclear armaments. I mean, this is not a brilliant move. And to have people cheering for it, people who voted for this clown with the idea that he was the peace candidate. Because Biden was a warmonger. Of course, Biden was a warmonger, but it doesn't make the other warmonger a peace candidate. Are now cheering for this and pretending it's over, pretending this was the world's first war that only lasts a day and now it's over. And there's nothing over about it. This is that moment of George W. Bush standing on an aircraft carrier in San Diego Harbor and declaring mission accomplished. It doesn't make the mission accomplished. How are they going to run that country? They can't, Trump can't run anything beyond his own mouth. They can't run this country. How are they going to run that country? They ditched, Miss Nobel Peace Prize laureate in favor of the vice president of the guy that they, claimed they needed to overthrow to save the world. And she immediately denounced them. So, how's that going to go? Maybe they get a right-wing government to attempt to do what they want. Maybe they can send in only a few thousand advisors and overseers and make it work, but it doesn't seem likely. It seems likely that they're going to have uh, at best civil war and chaos ongoing in Venezuela while they try to move on to attacking Cuba and Mexico and Colombia. This is the worst U.S. government I've seen, and I didn't think I'd be able to say that after having seen some of the other ones.
So what happened? Was this a capture? Was this a kidnapping?
Well, if it happened to you or me, we would want it called a kidnapping, wouldn't we? I
Mhm.
mean, you capture a wild animal. You don't capture a human being in his bedroom. This is not what the word capture means. It's not a legal term. It's a colonial, imperialistic hunter term that at best should be reserved for the use by racist police and colonists. It shouldn't be used in the context of international relations. And if somebody were to, I mean, in the United States, unlike Venezuela, you could take a vote, you could take a poll and probably get a majority who would be happy to have our current president captured and disappeared. But it would be a disaster after it happened. I think he should be impeached and removed legally through a process that maintain some form of government afterwards. But you couldn't get that poll in Venezuela, even though there are many people who were and are opponents of Maduro. But to begin allowing countries to send in armed troops to kidnap and abduct heads of state. I mean, this is the height of lawlessness. The reason for creating international law, even if it was never quite honest and forthright back, from the 1940s to now, was to avoid this sort of thing. And even on their own terms, I mean, it's a disaster for the world, but even on their own terms, it's very unlikely to work. It's very unlikely to get them a right-wing country in Venezuela. It's very unlikely to get them Venezuela's oil. It's very unlikely to set a precedent where other countries bow down to them. And when other countries start imitating, imagine the disaster. There's a handful of countries, Latin American countries, Spain, a couple of European countries who have said a little something against this. But for the most, and Russia and China, hypocritically, because they'll like to do the same thing and get away with it too, have said things against it. But most heads of state, NATO countries, Canada, Europe, not one word, not one word, because of who did it, because it's Washington. If any other nation on earth were to do such a thing, it would be denounced immediately. Imagine if, the day after Trump said, if Iran does anything bad, we're locked and loaded and we're going to attack them. Imagine if the next day Iran had gone into some other country, say Saudi Arabia, and kidnapped the king and dragged him off to an Iranian court. Imagine, could you get a voice on corporate US media to say that that was a capture and a law enforcement action? I wouldn't believe it for a second.
What we hear that this is about the oil. Who is it? Exxon Mobil, Chevron? I mean, is the president really acting on their behalf?
Well, I think to a great extent. I wouldn't reduce the complex motivations of something like this that's been building for years to one single thing and everything else is pretense, because there are other factors here. But that's a big one. And, I was talking to a random person the other day who said, why are they just attacking random countries? And I said, get out a list of which countries have the most oil and see who's number one. And then tell me it's a random country. There's nothing random about it at all. This has been in the works since Hugo Chavez came to power, openly talked about, promoted, and they did have those oil companies and others exploiting the not just the property of the people of Venezuela, but materials that are going to make it impossible for humanity to continue to live on this planet prior to Chavez taking over. How dare Venezuela be located anywhere near the United States and think it can have its own country and do its own bit of destroying the planet with its own resources when U.S. corporations want to do it for them? This is the outrage. This is the offense. And so it's about the oil and who profits from it and how much of those profits get used as bribes for politicians in Washington, D.C. But it's also about the offense, the lack of respect and subservience, the outrageous, the audacity of wanting to have your own country that does its own thing and uses some of its money to create a more equal society with some help for poor people rather than the reverse. And so when Marco Rubio says Cuba is next, Cuba was always going to be next. This is sort of the point, is the anger at Cuba. Remember that Tony Blair said, I'll help you attack Iraq if you'll attack Afghanistan first, right? Venezuela is Afghanistan in this scenario. Cuba is Iraq. Cuba is, where the target is. And Colombia and Mexico are in those crosshairs as well.
Well, why is Cuba such a focus? Is Cuba like Haiti? That is to say, they actually opposed the empire and won. Is that what this is?
I think that's the basis of it. Yes, the Cuban government was overthrown. A friendly U.S. subservient oligarch enriching government of crime and exploitation was overthrown by a popular uprising opposed by the United States, and following that opposition by the United States and looking for where else to turn, it turned to the Soviet Union. So this was a double affront. I mean, if outrage and revenge and anger at the Cuban government was ever going to go away before it became friends with the Soviet Union and later Russia, well, it was never going to after that. That is absolutely inexcusable. And Cuba is even closer than Venezuela, much closer than Venezuela, not 1,000 miles away, less than 100 miles away. And it's been the understanding of people in power in Washington, D.C. since day one, since the creation of Washington, D.C., that Cuba belongs to the United States and ought to be part of the United States. And the very idea of it being a separate country that makes its own decisions has been intolerable for these people. And when, despite the sanctions and the blockade and the hostility and the poverty imposed on Cuba, it manages to have programs of healthcare and job support and education that put the United States to shame and set an example for other countries. Well, that just compounds the outrage.
Is this because of Marco Rubio's, well, obvious familial connection to Cuba, or well, we now know that Cuba in the early 2000s, it was found that they are also OPEC eligible. They too have access to a lot of oil just off of their coast. Is Help me to understand, is this what this is about? Because is it just ideological, or is this about what the treasures that Cuba might hold, and Colombia and Mexico?
Oh, I think in every single case it's about oil, but it's also about other ways to exploit so-called natural resources and so-called human resources and markets. And they're putting plane loads of Wall Street vultures together right now to fly to Venezuela to try to figure out how they can make money off these people and the stuff below their feet that rightly belongs to Donald Trump. But it is also about Marco Rubio's family and ideology and the history of people who lost out, families that lost out in Cuba, never getting over it and wanting revenge, which, as you said in your opening remarks, is something that lasts a long, long time. And the people who are never going to get over what happened this week in Venezuela and are going to want revenge for it decades from now are real as well. It's also about the politics of Florida and how many people in Florida are super gung-ho passionate for revenge against the Cuban government. And it's also about the US military wanting its empire and wanting military bases, not just in Guantanamo, but in the rest of Cuba and the Caribbean and Venezuela. And so it's, why should there be a spot in this hemisphere that does not allow US military bases? The people of Ecuador just voted down reopening Ecuador to US military bases, but other countries across South America are opening themselves up to more US military bases, and this is supposed to be normal and acceptable and natural. They don't talk about Venezuela as Venezuela. They talk about it as territory within the Southern Command, which is, a portion of the globe belonging, as every other portion, to the US military.
So, do you think, how will this play out? How Help me to understand how what the what the administration and what, I guess, what the corporatocracy, what they plan, and who they might meet in Venezuela. I mean, do they think that, even though, like any other president, even the most popular ones, they have their opposition, but at some point, I think, David, does it not become about national sovereignty and pride? Do you think that President Trump's stated objective to come and take over the country, do you think that's going to work? Even with someone who's Venezuelan who might be working with the United States?
Typically, it doesn't. It doesn't work. And with the rhetoric that comes out of Trump's mouth and fingers, it's even less likely to. I mean, he has a hard time getting people around the world to support something that's openly for oil compared to pretending it's for humanitarian purposes and democracy and so forth. And of course, in the country where the sanctions have been imposed and the threats have been made and the government has been overthrown and people have been killed and injured and traumatized, it's even less likely. I mean, the history of these things is that it does not tend to work. I mean, they'll look to models of Dominican Republic and Panama and past overthrows and coups, and the putting in place of right-wing governments up and down the hemisphere. But there are as many failures as successes in the history. And here you have a situation where the so-called opposition was led by this woman they gave a Nobel Peace Prize to for demanding that her own country be attacked. And Trump has now, whether it's out of petty spite because he wanted the Nobel Peace Prize, even though she bowed down and gave it to him, or it's because of real recognition of how limited public support was for her and falling. But he immediately dismissed her and said, that's not the opposition. She doesn't have enough support. We have to go with the current vice president who has more support. Well, why does she have more support? Principally for opposing Donald Trump and the U.S. government prior to Trump. And so how are you going to work that? How are you going to square that circle? How are you going to use the support that comes out of opposition to your agenda to run the country on behalf of your agenda? I mean, these guys, are not smart enough to do a coherent post on social media, and they're gonna pull that off. I'm doubtful, it doesn't look like it's going to work to me. And the opposition to it in Venezuela is only going to grow. I mean, everybody's afraid. Nobody wants to stick their neck out and be the next victim, but people also have pride and respect and resentment and don't want to be occupied, don't want to be dictated to. And if having weapons of mass destruction and governments that commit human rights abuses and possessing oil and all of these things were a reason to go in and overthrow a government, well, then anybody on earth could go in and overthrow the US government in Washington. But then what would they do? Because even the US public, even the most accepting, subservient, docile, couch potato public in the history of the world would not stand for it for a minute. It's not that we would use the most strategic, powerful, nonviolent activism ever seen. A lot of the response would sadly be violent and possibly counterproductive, but it would be tumultuous. Everybody wouldn't lie down and take it if Germany or Saudi Arabia said they were going to run the United States. It just wouldn't fly. And when I talk to people in Venezuela, including World Beyond Wars Latin America organizer Gabriel Aguirre, who's in Caracas, he says no, the opposition is only growing, and nobody can predict exactly what's going to happen, but it's not a smooth run to a U.S. colony. At least it doesn't
Well,
look like it.
the opposition to.
Well, I mean opposition to Washington, D.C. I mean opposition
Mhm,
to Trump is only going to grow, and
mhm.
that means support for the sort of government that's just been undone. But there ought to be the demand for Maduro to be freed and returned. no matter what you think of Maduro, this is not the point. Whether you're Venezuelan or not, whether you think Maduro should be unelected or not, the bigger principle here is that you shouldn't be able to go in and kidnap a president. People sort of miss the key points and start saying, "Oh, well, can somebody go kidnap Netanyahu now?" No, we don't want Netanyahu
Mhm.
to be kidnapped. We want him to be prosecuted under the rule of law so that the rule of law can be applied to the world. And if you start normalizing presidential kidnappings, who do you think is going to do the very most of them? Netanyahu. So we have to try to restore some semblance of the rule of law. And there are dozens of things people can do if they go to rootsaction.org or worldbeyondwar.org. You can contact your congress members and senators. You can take part in and organize local events. There are global days of action coming up. There are local resolutions you can take and modify and get your city or town to pass. There are articles and videos and social media, and petitions and upcoming events and webinars. So people need to get active. This is the worst danger we've seen.
Well, why do you say that? I mean, if you're talking to all Americans, and because there are some Americans who believe that a narco terrorist was captured, to use the corporate media's term, and he is a bad man who's done bad things, and therefore he should be brought to justice in the United States and tried here. Some people actually have no problem with the president of Venezuela and his wife being dragged out of bed early in the morning. Speak to that.
Mm-hmm. The problem with shredding the rule of law and allowing criminal actions by governments, even when it's your government doing it to everybody else and claiming to uphold that rule of law in place for everybody else, just not for us, is that it won't work. And others will do it too. And Russia will do it, and China will do it, and dozens of other governments around the world will try to do it. This was the problem with drone wars that nobody wanted to hear when the US had all the drones, that everybody else was going to get them, and a lot of people were going to die, including people you care about, people who matter. This was the problem with the nuclear bomb when only the United States had it. It needed to be done away with, and it needed to be done away with under global international supervision, and it still does. And drones still do, and chemical and biological weapons still do. And how you deal with criminal governments and criminal individuals needs to be handled under the rule of law globally, not with a vigilante state. Whether you agree with one of its particular targets or not, this is a recipe for disaster, and it's a recipe for disaster in an age when there are more weapons in the world, including nuclear weapons, than we've ever seen before. And so labeling somebody a narco terrorist doesn't eliminate all of those concerns. They're not much of a narco when, they're not drug dealers, and you're freeing the biggest drug dealers you've put in prison because you think you can get their country to do as you say, and you really don't care a damn about drugs. They're not a terrorist because they're not doing terrorism. And there's no such thing as narco terrorism because drugs don't terrorize. But the actions done in the name of going after the narco terrorist are definitely both narco and terrorist. The United States government is addicted to war, and there is nothing more terrorist than threatening and bombing a city. Nothing terrorizes people more than that. And this is an act of terrorism, which is not a legal category. It's also an act of war, which is a legal category and the supreme international crime.
So where should Americans go with this now? I mean, What should
They
we do?
People around the world should go to U.S. embassies. People around the United States should go to national, state, and local governments and town squares and street corners. There are peace groups admirably organizing rallies and events all over the place. They should, again, check out the resources of all their local and national peace groups, including at rootsaction.org and worldbeyondwar.org, where there are resolutions you can push through local governments. I mean, it is hard to get a local government to denounce a war when local governments are pretty much entirely Democratic individuals, and the president is a Democrat. But now the president is a Republican, and almost all the Congress members cheering for this thing are Republicans. This is your opportunity to get completely, you know, uh, completely unscrupulous, unprincipled politicians to pass a resolution saying no to a war, and to pass that up the line to the state governments and the federal government and say no, we have to stop this thing. People should be calling their senators' offices day and night for the next 2 or 3 days until they have that vote again, to say no and to cut off the funding and put an end to this thing. But if this is not also an impeachable offense, nothing again ever will be. I mean, we thought impeachment was going to have to always be about sex, and it turns out that's not only not in the Constitution, but not true. They were willing to do impeachments, not convict in the Senate, but at least to impeach Trump over other matters. And we thought that impeachment had to be partisan, and it does look like it does have to be partisan, but at least get all the Democrats on board. If you're a so-called Democrat opposing Donald Trump in every way, but you're supporting this, and you're not treating it as impeachable, what the heck are you? I mean, this is not opposition at all. This is Republican support. If you're supporting this, you're not going to be able to deal with the environmental crisis, with the homelessness crisis, with the educational crisis, with the abuses of militarism in our cities and states, if you allow this president to do war after war without regard to anybody else. So we need our Congress members to be impeaching and removing from office Donald Trump immediately. And that this is not time to be a New York Times politician, where the CNN politician, where you claim to be against Trump, and you denounce Trump, but you cheer for his wars. You cheer for the principal thing he does. You cheer for what 60% of federal discretionary spending goes into. I mean, this is unacceptable. We have to put war on the agenda. We have to make it a topic. We have to stop having all these Democrats run for Congress, as they're going to do in November, with websites, with elaborate platforms of all the positions they take on everything, with no mention of the budget, and no mention of the military, and no mention of the 96% of humanity that exists outside this country but is impacted by this country. We have to start demanding more of this government, or we're not going to have a government.
You said that President Maduro and his wife and son should be freed. Why?
Because they've been kidnapped. Every kidnapped victim should be freed. Whatever you think of Maduro, if Donald Trump had been kidnapped by the Canadian government and dragged off to Ottawa and thrown in a prison cell, the sort of place where I've thought he belonged for decades, I would say he should be freed. Because you can't have international kidnappings by governments accompanied with bombings that kill dozens of people, accompanied with cold-blooded murder of their security guards. You can't have that and have a world we want to live in. And it doesn't matter who that president is. It doesn't matter what party they belong to. It doesn't matter what good and bad they've done in office. If you wanted to support nonviolent building of democratic societies within other countries, I mean, I would support that, but the place to start would be here. Why not try it in the United States? Why assert your ability to run other countries when you can't run this one, where people don't have the right to free speech and assembly anymore, where you don't have the right to organize in the workplace, where you don't have elections where you can put names on the ballot, where state after state for one party or the other is re-gerrymandering to make even more districts guaranteed to one party or the other, and strengthening the bribery and the corruption so that incumbents are even more empowered to stay in for life no matter how awful they performed. Why not work on building on leading by example, on showing the world how you do democracy? I mean, we have a Democratic Party that's called the Democratic Party, where if you run against an incumbent in a Democratic primary, you're denounced for being anti-democratic, unless the Democrat who's won the nomination for, I don't know, mayor of New York or mayor of Buffalo or someplace else is too democratic, small d, is too interested in actually representing people. Well, then it's okay to go and run somebody against them even as an independent. This is not how. If this is what you think democracy is, yeah, I mean, at least drop the pretense and admit that you're just stealing oil. But then if you're just stealing oil, are we going to accept that? Are we going to live with that? I mean, are you going to have Congress members criticizing the Iranian government with a straight face, or any other government ever, for anything? I mean, they're just going to be in no position to do so. The hypocrisy is just going to be too sadly ridiculous. And so, the idea that you should do a popularity poll, that you should figure out if somebody should be elected prom king or not, and then decide whether he should be freed from a kidnapping and a bombing and an infiltration of a country by a military. This is to demonstrate that we have absolutely no notion of what the rule of law is supposed to be, even. I mean, somebody should be convicted of a crime if they have committed the crime, if they're found guilty in a fair trial in a court of law that has jurisdiction to try them. And this means that Venezuelans need to be tried in Venezuela, or they need to be tried through an international court, or through a universal claim to jurisdiction that does not involve kidnapping them or bombing their country, which is worse than anything they could be accused of and tried for. So, yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not a believer in most incarceration, and I think most people should be freed, even those guilty of many crimes. But uh, I certainly think that a president, even the very worst of them, should not be kidnapped and put on trial in a country whose government is trying to take over his country. I mean, this is to apply a veneer of the rule of law and cops of the world, law enforcement, to colonial imperial criminality.
Do you think, as we begin to wrap things up, do you think that progressives or people on the right and the left, wherever people feel they are ideologically, that they should find common cause with people who are on the other side of the aisle, if you will? You find people, for example, like Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are ardently opposed to this, and they have articulated, uh, they've been very specific about why it is and what happened this past weekend was wrong. Um, or do you think that people should just stay in their silos? Should people find common cause or not and end this?
Well, I think to the extent that you can agree with somebody on one issue, you should work with them on that issue. I know there are extremes and possible exceptions when somebody is doing too much damage, is too horribly offensive on eight other issues. But when you're talking about elected officials, right? Nobody should ever, ever, ever become a fan or a cheerleader or a supporter or be on the team of some elected official. But when that elected official is pushing a particular piece of legislation or a vote in Congress that you agree with, you should support it too. I mean, if Congressman Massey and Congressman Khanna and dozens of others are promoting a vote against war, you shouldn't, survey how many opinions you share with Massey or Kana. I mean, if you share many opinions with one of them, you're not going to share many with the other. You should simply decide whether you support voting against war. My Senator Tim Kaine here in Virginia, I mean, I consider, an absolutely reprehensible individual who's done horrible damage to the world, who's been incredibly hypocritical, who I've agreed with maybe 5 times out of 500. But when he is doing the right thing and leading the way in the Senate on trying to get votes to oppose a war, even when it's a sort of vote I never would have created. I mean, I never would have had these, corrupt court jesters, these clownish imitations of legislators be holding a vote every time there's a war to say whether it's a war or not. I mean, it's ridiculous. But given that system and given those individuals, do I want them to vote yes? Yeah, I want them to vote yes. It's much better than them voting no again. And when you've had Marco Rubio and Donald Trump privately and publicly say, oh no, you don't need to vote against a war on Venezuela because there's not going to be any war on Venezuela. And then do all of these actions that are war and nothing but war. Uh, I want those senators to have some semblance of self respect, to at least pretend to have some self respect, to at least show a little resentment that they were lied to, that they were conned, and say, oh no, we're going to come back and vote again, and we're going to vote against your war because you told us there would be no war, and here's the war. And don't tell us it's over. We've seen this movie before. And even if it's over, we're stopping it. No more. No funding for starting it up again. No funding for continuing it. No funding for keeping those ships in the Southern Caribbean. Bring them back to Norfolk. I mean, when 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 George W. Bush and Tony Blair were sitting in a room in the White House conspiring, how can we start a war in Iraq? Oh, let's take an airplane and paint it with United Nations colors and fly it low and see if we can get the Iraqis to shoot at it. Or let's, 5 different cockamamie schemes for getting the war started. And then Bush and Blair walked out and did a press conference and said, we're doing everything we can to avoid war, but if it comes to war, we're prepared. Those reporters who sat there and swallowed that obvious, defecation on their faces, not since then has one of them said, I'm offended. I resent that. I wish they hadn't blatantly lied to us. I wish they hadn't played us for fools. Like, I don't want the United States Senate and House to have as little self-respect as those so-called journalists. I don't want them to sit back and take it. I might start to have a glimmer of respect for them if they would stand up for themselves. If they would say, we are the first branch of government. We are Article 1 of the Constitution. Forget this, you know, equal branches nonsense. Forget this president runs the world nonsense. We, Article 1, Section 8, all the powers, they belong to us. The president's our executive. Put him back behind his desk. Let him execute what we tell him to execute. Here's what the law's going to be. Then I would start to have some respect for them, even if they were still taking all that money from all those horrible places that fund their horrible campaigns. I would start to respect them if they would stand up on their hind legs and bark a little bit once in a while.
What do you want us to know before you go? Because we're going to see a lot about this war. going forward, or maybe we won't. What would you ask the American people in particular to do?
Well, I think take all of the steps to try to put a halt to this war, to reject it, to renounce it, and to hold accountable those who are behind it, and thereby to prevent the promised attacks on Cuba and Mexico and Colombia and so forth. And secondly, to follow the money, to go after the money, to understand that if you put over $1 trillion a year of badly needed resources, of resources that we need for our schools and our houses and our parks and our infrastructure and our protection from the looming environmental collapse, into a war machine, you're going to get wars. You're going to get wars. And so stop supporting or accepting or even voting for people who won't commit to moving the money out of the war machine and into everything else. Because if they won't do that, if they won't actually work to block the military spending bills unless it's reduced rather than increased, as it's increased every year, then they're not helping. They're hurting, and it doesn't matter what good speeches or what minor little tweaks they make to the US government. It doesn't matter if they sign on to legislation that would cut the military budget while year after year after year they allow the military budget to be increased. If they won't actually take a stand and work to move the money out of the war machine, they're no use to us.
David Swanson, World Beyond War and Roots Action. How can we get in touch with World Beyond War? How can we get in touch with Roots Action so that we can do what we can do to try and end this madness?
Yeah, well, go to worldbeyondwar.org and you'll see a big link to all the materials and things that are happening about Venezuela. Go to rootsaction.org and you'll see right at the top how to click and send an email. And please add your own words to your senators and so-called representative based on your address, and further steps you can take thereafter and spread the word to others. This is when we should be more active while we're still allowed to be to some extent. And it's encouraging to see those who are getting active, and we need those who have been, those who've done this over and over again to do it one more time, and those who've not helped out before to join in. We are many, they are few, but if we are all watching football, it's they're going to run the world.
David Swanson, World Beyond War. It is possible, everybody. And in fact, it's right here. All you have to do is change your mind, change your thinking. I am Santita Jackson, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. More about Venezuela in just a minute.